Adding to all the recent terrible injury news for the Golden State Warriors, now we have to throw in Steph Curry, who broke his hand in last night's game. Welcome back, everybody, to your number one source for learning about everything related to sports injuries and sports medicine news. In today's video, we're going to take a look at Steph Curry's hand fracture, taking a look at the footage, the mechanism of his fall, talking about hand fractures in particular, and also touching on something important to understand with possible wrist fractures. Make sure and go subscribe if you like this type of content and want to stay up to date with my future videos. Let's get started. Now, the initial reports, particularly from Ramona Shelburne, is that the Warriors fear he broke specifically his second metacarpal, which is one of the long bones in his hand, kind of under the palm, as we'll talk about. He's going to have a CT scan today to determine the full extent of injury, and then they'll determine treatment plan going forward. Curry's mechanism of injury is something we call a foosh, or a fall on an outstretched hand. As you can see when he comes down, he actually lands on both hands, but it looks like that left one might have taken a little bit more of the load. Now, if you watch through the end of the play, it's possible the fracture might have occurred more when Baines kind of rolled back on him, as opposed to just that initial impact of the ground, just because his hand gets kind of bent upward under him, a little bit awkward here when Baines kind of falls back on him. So that could be a possibility too, but we're going to talk specifically about what it looks like happened with this so-called foosh. Running through it again, fall on an outstretched hand, he lands, both those hands are outstretched, open hand, lands, make contacts. That's the risk for the injury. Moving on next, let's touch on the anatomy in the hand, the wrist, and then talk specifically about these types of fractures. We can divide the hand bones into the carpal bones, which are the wrist bones, the metacarpals, which are the long bones of the fingers, and those are sitting within the palm, and then the phalanges, and these are the finger bones. The report is he broke his second metacarpal, so that would be the metacarpal for his index finger right here. Let's zoom in on this metacarpal and talk about the different types of fractures we can see and what that might mean. If we break this metacarpal down into three zones, we have the shaft, which is the long skinny part in the middle. We have the neck, which is closer to the end where it starts to curve out. And then we have the head, which is sort of the ball at the two ends of the metacarpal. We can really have fractures in any of these three locations, but a lot of times we see them here at the shaft, kind of in the middle. Within the shaft, we can have different types of fracture patterns. The most common is just a transverse fracture, where the fracture line basically cuts straight across through the bone. We often see this if someone lands when their fist is clenched. For example, if someone has a baseball in their hand and they land while holding the baseball, or if the fist is just clenched when they make contact. Another type of fracture pattern is a spiral or an oblique fracture. This usually occurs more when someone lands when their hand is open and outstretched, sort of like what happened with Curry. This fracture pattern sort of spirals up the bone as opposed to going straight across. That's why it's called a spiral or an oblique fracture. We can also then get fractures up at the neck of the metacarpal. Whenever this happens in the fifth metacarpal of the small finger, we call this a boxer's fracture. And then you can also get a fracture through the metacarpal head. Looking back at Curry's mechanism here, remember his hand is open. So just going purely off the fact that he landed with an open hand, I would be worried more about the spiral or oblique types of fractures. A lot of times we see wrist fractures with this particular mechanism of falling on an outstretched hand, and those can be pretty bad as well. So I want to talk about that just really quick. One of the specific carpal bones in the wrist is called the scaphoid. This is the one that we really worry about when someone has a fall on an outstretched hand, because the presentation of a fracture can actually be delayed by a couple of weeks. We typically can have someone who falls, they come in, their x-ray initially looks totally normal, but then they still have pain, and they come back a week or two later, and now we can see the x-ray. This is one of those bones in our body that's really susceptible to death whenever you don't have good blood flow after a fracture. So we have to keep a really, really close eye on this. So it's possible there could be a fracture in this bone that just wasn't seen on the x-ray that hopefully would come out with future imaging. Finally, what's going to determine whether or not Curry has to undergo surgery for this fracture? It all comes down to how displaced or out of alignment the bones are after the fracture. If you get a simple fracture where everything stays nice in alignment, there's no change in the angle between the bones, then these can be healed without surgery. But the time when you would need surgery is whenever the fracture results in severe displacement of those bones. The two primary ones that surgeons will look at is the degree of angulation and the amount of shortening. The angulation is the angle between the two ends on the other sides of the fracture. Usually here we're talking about 10 to 20 degrees of angulation that might require someone needs surgery. The other thing to think about is the amount of shortening. So if you've got two ends of a fracture and afterwards it kind of slips or shortens that bone, if that shortening is enough, that's going to be another reason why you need to do something else for management. Sometimes if there's just shortening but there's no change in the angle, they can just put someone in a cast and allow it to heal that way, but you're going to have some potential cosmetic concerns. Certainly if there's been excessive angulation plus shortening, or even just excessive angulation, that's going to require surgery to make sure those bones get back in proper alignment to allow adequate healing. In the case where someone just needs to wear a cast to allow for proper healing, sometimes that can just be on the order of a month or so, but we really need more information from the CT scan and other studies to determine things like, does he need surgery? Can this be healed with just a cast? And are there any other potential injuries? That's it for the video though, everybody. Thank you as always for watching, and until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.